Maria Thompson lived a quiet, unassuming life in a small town where everyone knew each other's business. The streets were lined with modest houses, and the air carried the faint smell of freshly baked bread from the local bakery. Maria wasn't someone who stood out. She didn't have expensive clothes, flashy jewelry, or a high-powered job. Instead, she worked 2 shifts at a diner during the day and cleaned offices at night to make ends meet. Her teenage daughter, Lily, was her pride and joy, and everything Maria did was for her. Despite the challenges of being a single mother, Maria had always managed to keep things together. She lived in a cozy little apartment on the 2nd floor of an old brick building owned by Mr. Harold Grayson, one of the wealthiest men in town. Mr. Grayson rarely visited his properties. He left them in the hands of a property manager named Carl, who was notorious for cutting corners and treating tenants poorly. Still, Maria paid her rent on time every month and took care of her home, making sure it stayed clean and welcoming despite its worn-out fixtures. One chilly autumn morning, however, Maria's world turned upside down. She returned from her early shift at the diner to find her front door wide open and all her belongings piled haphazardly in the hallway. Shocked and confused, she called Carl immediately, only to be told that she had been evicted. "You're late on your rent," he said coldly over the phone. "We gave you notice last week." But Maria hadn't received any notice. In fact, she had just handed over her latest rent payment 3 days prior. Furious and desperate, she demanded answers, but Carl refused to listen. He claimed the eviction was legal and warned her not to cause trouble if she wanted any chance of finding another place to live. For weeks, Maria tried everything she could think of to fix the situation. She pleaded with Mr. Grayson's office, spoke to neighbors, and even reached out to local charities for help. But no one seemed willing or able to intervene. As days turned into weeks, Maria and Lily found themselves living out of their car, relying on public restrooms to wash up and eating cheap meals from fast food joints. It was humiliating and exhausting, but what hurt most was seeing the toll it took on Lily. The once cheerful teenager became withdrawn, skipping school more often than attending. Maria felt like she was failing as a mother, and guilt gnawed at her constantly. Determined to fight back, Maria decided to take matters into her own hands. She had heard about people suing landlords in court, but the idea terrified her. She didn't know anything about the law, let alone how to navigate a courtroom. Still, something inside her refused to give up. Late at night, after finishing her cleaning job, Maria sat at the kitchen table of a friend's house where she occasionally stayed and began researching tenant rights online. With Lily asleep on the couch beside her, she scrolled through websites, jotting down notes and printing out documents that might support her case. Filing the lawsuit was harder than she expected. The forms were confusing, filled with legal jargon that made her head spin, but Maria persevered, filling them out carefully and attaching copies of her lease agreement and proof of rent payments. When she finally submitted the paperwork to the courthouse, she felt a mix of relief and dread. Relief because she had taken action, and dread because she knew the road ahead would be difficult. Word of Maria's lawsuit spread quickly through the tight-knit community. Some people admired her courage, whispering that it was about time someone stood up to Mr. Grayson and his shady practices. Others, however, laughed at her audacity. "What does she think she's doing?" they muttered behind closed doors. "She doesn't stand a chance against those lawyers." Even Lily expressed doubts, asking her mom why she couldn't just let it go and focus on finding a new place to live. Maria understood their skepticism. After all, she was going up against one of the richest men in town, represented by a team of experienced attorneys. What chance did a simple woman like her really have? Yet deep down, she believed in fairness. She believed that right was on her side, and she clung to that belief like a lifeline. Every evening, she practiced presenting her case aloud, imagining herself in the courtroom, speaking clearly and confidently. She rehearsed until her voice grew hoarse, determined to prove that ordinary people could still seek justice, even when the odds were stacked against them. The closer the trial date approached, the more anxious Maria became. She spent hours preparing, gathering evidence and memorizing key points. She read articles about similar cases, learning how others had won against powerful opponents. Slowly but surely, she began to feel a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could pull this off. And if she succeeded, it wouldn't just be a victory for her. It would be a victory for everyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. Little did Maria know, her journey was only beginning. The courtroom awaited, filled with challenges and surprises that would test her resolve like never before. But one thing was certain. Whether she won or lost, Maria Thompson was about to leave an indelible mark on her small town, and perhaps on herself as well. The morning of the trial arrived, and Maria woke up before dawn. She hadn't slept much the night before, her mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. Her stomach churned as she got ready, carefully choosing her outfit, a plain navy blue dress that had been a gift from her sister years ago. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean and pressed, giving her a sense of dignity despite the circumstances. She tied her hair back into a neat bun, applied a touch of makeup to hide the dark circles under her eyes, and slipped on her most comfortable shoes, knowing she'd likely be standing for hours. Lily stirred in her sleep as Maria quietly packed, her folder full of notes, documents, and printouts. She hesitated for a moment, looking at her daughter's peaceful face. "This is for you," she whispered softly, brushing a strand of hair away from Lily's forehead. Then, taking a deep breath, Maria grabbed her bag and headed out the door. The courthouse was an imposing building made of gray stone, its tall columns casting long shadows across the steps leading up to the entrance. Maria felt small as she climbed, clutching her folder tightly against her chest. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. The room buzzed with activity. Lawyers in sharp suits shuffled papers, court clerks hurried back and forth, and people sat nervously in rows of wooden benches waiting for their cases to be called. Maria found a seat near the back, trying to blend, and while she waited for her turn, she observed the other cases unfolding before hers, watching how attorneys argued passionately and judges listened intently. Each time someone spoke, Maria imagined herself doing the same, rehearsing her opening statement silently in her head. Still, doubt lingered in the corners of her mind. What if she froze? What if they laughed at her or dismissed her claims outright? Finally, the clerk called her name. "Maria Thompson versus Harold Grayson," he announced in a monotone voice. Maria's heart skipped a beat as she stood up, smoothing her dress one last time before walking toward the front of the courtroom. As she approached the plaintiff's table, she noticed the defense team already seated, two well-dressed lawyers accompanied by Carl, the property manager who had evicted her. They glanced at her briefly, their expressions smug and dismissive. Tatiuan. Judge entered moments later, a stern-looking man with silver hair and glasses perched on the edge of his nose. He adjusted his robe and scanned the room before addressing both parties. "Let's begin," he said curtly. Maria introduced herself when prompted, her voice trembling slightly but clear enough to be heard. On the other side, the defense attorney rose confidently to introduce himself and his client. His tone dripped with authority, and Maria couldn't help but feel intimidated. When it came time for Maria to present her case, she took a shaky step forward. Holding her folder close, she began explaining her situation, the unlawful eviction, the missing notice, and the tampered lease agreement. But almost immediately, the defense attorney interrupted her. "Your Honor," he interjected smoothly, flashing a practiced smile, "I believe we're wasting valuable time here. This individual clearly has no understanding of legal procedures. Perhaps this matter would be better resolved outside of court." The comment drew a few chuckles from the gallery, and Maria felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. The judge raised an eyebrow but didn't reprimand the attorney. Instead, he turned to Maria and said, "Ms. Thompson, please try to stay focused. We don't have all day." Maria nodded, swallowing hard. She forced herself to continue, laying out her evidence piece by piece. She showed the original lease agreement, pointing out the clause that required written notice before eviction. She presented bank statements proving she had paid her rent on time every month. And she shared photos of her belongings dumped carelessly in the hallway, evidence of the abrupt and illegal nature of her removal. But the defense attorney wasn't fazed. If anything, he seemed amused. Leaning casually against the podium, he countered each of Maria's points with ease. "Your Honor," he said with a smirk, "the plaintiff is misinterpreting the terms of the lease. Furthermore, these so-called proofs are hardly credible. Anyone can forge documents these days." He gestured dramatically toward Maria, as if daring her to respond. Maria clenched her fists beneath the table, fighting back tears of frustration. She knew he was wrong, but how could she prove it? Her lack of legal training left her feeling powerless, like she was speaking a different language entirely. The courtroom grew quieter as the defense continued to dominate the conversation, painting Maria as naive and unprepared. Then came the cross-examination. The defense attorney stepped closer to Maria, his demeanor shifting from mocking to outright condescending. "Ms. Thompson," he began, his tone dripping with sarcasm, "you claim to understand tenant rights, yet you admit you have no formal education in law. Is that correct?" "Yes," Maria replied softly, her voice barely audible. "And you expect this court to take your word over that of a licensed property manager and a respected landlord?" he pressed, raising his eyebrows theatrically. "Isn't it possible you simply forgot to pay your rent and are now fabricating excuses to avoid responsibility?" Maria flinched at the accusation, her hands tightening around the edges of her folder. She wanted to scream, to tell him he was twisting the truth, but she bit her tongue. Instead, she looked down at her notes, searching for something, anything, that might salvage her crumbling confidence. The judge watched the exchange with a neutral expression, occasionally scribbling notes on a pad in front of him. To Maria, it felt like hours passed as the defense attorney peppered her with questions designed to trip her up. By the time he finished, she was visibly shaken, her earlier resolve wavering under the weight of relentless scrutiny. Just when it seemed like all hope was lost, Maria caught sight of something in the corner of her folder, a photocopy of the altered lease agreement she had discovered during her research. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable unless you were looking for it, but it was there. A line crossed out and rewritten in ink, changing the terms of the original contract. Her heart raced as she realized this could be her lifeline, summoning every ounce of courage she had left. Maria cleared her throat and spoke up. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steadier than she expected, "may I address one final point?" The judge nodded, though his expression remained skeptical. Slowly, Maria held up the document, pointing out the discrepancy between the original lease and the version submitted by the defense. For the first time since the trial began, the room fell completely silent. The defense attorney's confident grin faltered, replaced by a flicker of unease. "That's irrelevant," he snapped quickly, attempting to regain control. But Maria pressed on, citing specific sections of tenant rights laws she had memorized and connecting them directly to the evidence in front of her. With each sentence, her confidence grew, and the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted ever so slightly. Though the battle was far from over, Maria had planted a seed of doubt, one that would soon grow into something far greater than she could have imagined. The courtroom was eerily quiet as Maria stood there, holding the altered lease agreement in her trembling hands. She could feel all eyes on her, the judge's sharp gaze, the defense attorney's narrowed eyes, and even the curious stares of the few spectators seated in the gallery. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it, but she forced herself to focus. This was her moment, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. "Your Honor," Maria began, her voice stronger now, "I believe this document proves that my eviction was not only illegal but also based on falsified evidence." She placed the photocopy of the altered lease agreement on the judge's desk, then handed another copy to the defense attorney, who reluctantly took it. His earlier smugness had faded slightly, replaced by a flicker of unease. Maria pointed to the specific section of the lease where the critical clause about eviction notices had been tampered with. "Here," she said, tapping the paper gently, "you can see that the original lease clearly states tenants must receive written notice at least 30 days before an eviction. But in the version submitted by the defense, this line has been crossed out and rewritten to say something completely different." The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Your Honor," he interjected quickly, attempting to regain control of the situation. "This is nothing more than speculation. Anyone could have altered these documents after the fact. There's no proof that my client or his property manager did anything wrong." But Maria didn't back down. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, her expression calm yet resolute. "If I may continue, Your Honor," she said politely, meeting the judge's gaze. When the judge nodded, she went on. "I understand the concern about authenticity. However, I've brought additional evidence to support my claim. For example, here are emails between myself and Carl, the property manager, confirming that I had paid my rent on time. And here," she held up another document, "is a time-stamped receipt from my bank showing the exact date and amount of the payment." She paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words sink in. Then, turning her attention back to the altered lease, she added, "Furthermore, I consulted several online resources about tenant rights, which confirm that any changes to a lease agreement must be agreed upon by both parties in writing. Since I never signed off on these alterations, they are invalid under the law." By now, the defense attorney's confidence was visibly crumbling. He glanced at his notes, searching for a counter-argument, but Maria's meticulous preparation left little room for maneuvering. The judge, too, seemed intrigued. He picked up the documents Maria had provided, examining them closely. For the first time since the trial began, he addressed the defense directly. "Mr. Peterson," the judge said, looking over his glasses at the attorney, "can you explain why there appears to be a discrepancy between the two versions of the lease agreement?" The defense attorney cleared his throat, stalling for time. "Your Honor, as I mentioned earlier, these accusations are baseless. My client operates within the bounds of the law, and we stand by the validity of our documentation." The judge frowned, clearly unimpressed. "That doesn't answer my question, Counselor. If the plaintiff is correct and these documents were indeed tampered with, then your client's actions would constitute fraud, a serious offense. Are you prepared to testify under oath that everything presented here today is accurate and truthful?" For a brief moment, panic flashed across the attorney's face. He hesitated, glancing at Carl, who sat stiffly beside him, avoiding eye contact. Finally, the attorney muttered, "We'll need time to review the allegations, Your Honor." Maria felt a surge of triumph, though she kept her emotions in check. She knew better than to gloat, especially in front of the judge. Instead, she simply nodded respectfully and returned to her seat, her folder clutched tightly against her chest. As she sat down, she allowed herself a small, private smile. For the first time, she felt like she might actually have a chance. Meanwhile, in the gallery, whispers broke out among the spectators. Some looked impressed by Maria's poise and determination, while others exchanged skeptical glances, still unsure whether this unassuming woman could truly take on such a powerful opponent. One elderly man sitting near the front leaned over to his companion and whispered, "Did you see that?" She caught them red-handed. Back at the defense table, tensions were running high. Carl tugged nervously at his collar, sweat beading on his forehead. The defense attorney scribbled furiously on a legal pad, trying to come up with a strategy to salvage the situation. But the damage had already been done. Maria's revelation had planted a seed of doubt, not just in the judge's mind, but in the minds of everyone present. As the proceedings continued, the judge asked Maria to elaborate further on her research into tenant rights laws. Encouraged by his interest, Maria spoke confidently, citing specific statutes and precedents she had studied during her late-night sessions. She explained how these laws protected tenants from unfair practices and emphasized that her case was not unique. Thousands of renters across the country faced similar injustices every year. Her words resonated deeply, not just with the judge, but with others in the courtroom as well. Even the bailiff, who had initially seemed indifferent, now listened intently, nodding occasionally as Maria made her points. It was clear that her passion and dedication were winning people over, one argument at a time. Finally, the judge turned to the defense once more. "Counselor," he said sternly, "based on what I've seen so far, it appears there are significant questions regarding the legitimacy of your client's actions. Unless you can provide concrete evidence to refute the plaintiff's claims, I will have no choice but to rule in her favor." The defense attorney opened his mouth to respond but closed it again, unable to find the right words. Beside him, Carl slumped lower in his chair, his face pale. Maria watched silently, her heart racing. She knew the battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time she felt like she was winning. Outside the courthouse, reporters lingered, hoping to catch a glimpse of the unfolding drama. Word had spread quickly about the unexpected twist in the trial, and curiosity was mounting. If Maria succeeded, it would send shockwaves through the community, and perhaps inspire others to fight for their own rights. But for now, Maria focused on staying calm and composed. She knew the hardest part was still ahead, but she also knew she had done everything she could to prepare. Whatever happened next, she told herself, she would face it with courage and grace. After all, this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about proving that justice could prevail, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. The courtroom was tense, the kind of quiet that feels heavy with anticipation. Maria sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands gripping the edge as she waited for the next phase of the trial. She could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her, some curious, some skeptical, and others downright hostile. But there was a new energy in the air now, one that hadn't been there before. The judge's pointed questions and the defense's faltering responses had shifted the momentum, and Maria knew it. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't just fighting against an impossible system. She was part of something bigger. Amen. Defense attorney Mr. Peterson stood up again, his usual confidence replaced by a forced bravado. He adjusted his tie and cleared his throat loudly, trying to regain control of the narrative. Your Honor, he began, his voice overly formal, the plaintiff has presented interesting theories, but theories alone do not constitute evidence. My client has followed all legal procedures to the letter. Maria stiffened slightly at his words, but she didn't react outwardly. Instead, she kept her focus sharp, watching every move he made. She had learned quickly during this trial that staying calm under pressure was key. If she let her emotions get the better of her, she'd lose the upper hand she had worked so hard to gain. Peterson continued, pacing back and forth as if trying to appear authoritative. Furthermore, he said, pointing vaguely toward Maria, there is no conclusive proof that any tampering occurred. Even if discrepancies exist, and I'm not saying they do, it doesn't necessarily mean wrongdoing. Mistakes happen. Documents can be misfiled or misunderstood. Maria listened carefully, analyzing each sentence. When he finished, she took a deep breath and stood up slowly. Her heart raced, but she reminded herself of the countless hours she'd spent researching tenant rights laws and practicing her arguments. This was her chance to dismantle his claims piece by piece. Your Honor, she began, her voice steady despite the storm of nerves inside her. I understand the defense's attempt to cast doubt, but let's look at the facts objectively. She stepped closer to the judge's bench, holding up the original lease agreement alongside the altered version. These documents speak for themselves. The changes are deliberate and significant, not accidental errors, and these changes directly violate state tenant laws. She paused, letting her words sink in. Then, turning slightly to address the gallery as well as the judge, she added, it's important to remember why we're here today. This isn't about paperwork or technicalities. It's about fairness. When someone works hard, pays their rent on time, and follows the rules, they deserve to be treated with respect. What happened to me wasn't just unfair, it was illegal. Her tone softened slightly as she spoke, allowing a hint of vulnerability to show. I'm not a lawyer. I don't have fancy degrees or expensive suits. All I have is my truth and the law on my side. And according to the law, tenants cannot be evicted without proper notice unless there's documented misconduct. There was no misconduct in my case, just an unlawful eviction based on falsified documents. The courtroom was silent, except for the faint rustling of papers. Even the reporters in the back row stopped typing, captivated by Maria's words. For the first time, people weren't seeing her as just a struggling single mother. They were seeing her as someone who refused to back down, someone willing to stand up for what was right. The judge leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful. "Ms. Thompson," he said, addressing her directly, "you've raised some compelling points. However, I need more than circumstantial evidence to rule in your favor. Can you provide any additional proof to support your claims?" Maria nodded confidently. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, pulling out another set of documents from her folder. "Here are copies of communication between myself and the property manager, Carl. These emails confirm that I paid my rent on time every month. You'll also find bank statements showing the exact dates and amounts of those payments." She handed the documents to the bailiff, who passed them along to the judge. As he reviewed them, Maria pressed on. "Additionally, I'd like to highlight Section 42.711 of our state's Tenant Rights Code, which explicitly states that landlords must provide written notice of at least 30 days prior to eviction, unless there's a breach of contract. Since no such breach occurred in my case, the eviction was unlawful." Peterson tried to interject, but the judge held up a hand, silencing him. "Let Ms. Thompson finish," he instructed firmly. Encouraged by the judge's support, Maria grew bolder. "Finally, Your Honor, I'd like to address the defense's claim that mistakes happen. While that may be true in some cases, this situation involves clear intent. Why else would someone alter a legally binding document? Why else would they fail to notify me of the supposed issue? The answer is simple: because they knew what they were doing was wrong." Her final words hung in the air, echoing through the courtroom. The tension was palpable, and even the defense team seemed rattled. Peterson glanced nervously at Carl, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. It was obvious they hadn't anticipated Maria being so prepared or so persuasive. When it was Peterson's turn to respond, his rebuttal lacked its earlier bite. He stumbled over his words, repeating vague phrases about misunderstandings and technicalities. Each attempt to discredit Maria only seemed to highlight her credibility further. By the time he finished, the judge appeared thoroughly unimpressed. "Thank you, counselor," the judge said dryly, turning his attention back to Maria. "Ms. Thompson, do you have anything else to add?" Maria hesitated for a moment, then shook her head. "No, Your Honor. I believe I've said everything I needed to say." The judge nodded, leaning back in his chair as he considered the arguments. After several long minutes, he spoke again. "Based on the evidence presented today, I see sufficient grounds to question the legitimacy of the defendant's actions. Until further clarification is provided, I will temporarily grant Ms. Thompson possession of her former residence. Additionally, I am ordering a full investigation into the allegations of document tampering. We will reconvene next week for closing arguments." A wave of relief washed over Maria as the gavel came down. She hadn't won outright yet, but this was a major victory, a lifeline that gave her hope for the future. Outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed around her, eager to hear her thoughts. For once, she didn't shy away from the attention. With Lily standing proudly beside her, Maria faced the cameras and shared her story, inspiring others to believe that justice was possible, even for someone like her. As the day ended, Maria realized something profound. This trial wasn't just about reclaiming her home. It was about proving that ordinary people could make extraordinary things happen when they refused to give up. And no matter what happened next, she knew she had already changed the course of her life, and perhaps the lives of others, for the better. The week following the judge's temporary ruling felt like both an eternity and a fleeting moment for Maria. On one hand, she was overwhelmed by the whirlwind of attention her case had garnered. Reporters called her nonstop. Neighbors who once whispered about her now greeted her warmly, and even strangers approached her at the grocery store to offer words of encouragement. On the other hand, the looming final verdict weighed heavily on her mind. She knew the battle wasn't over yet. Far from it. The defense still had a chance to regroup, and Mr. Peterson, the slick attorney representing Mr. Grayson, was not someone who gave up easily. Maria spent every spare moment preparing for the next hearing. She pored over legal texts she borrowed from the library, revisited her notes, and rehearsed her closing statement until she could recite it in her sleep. Late at night, after Lily drifted off, Maria would sit at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, jotting down new points or refining old ones. Her determination hadn't wavered, but exhaustion was starting to creep in. Dark circles formed under her eyes and her hands trembled slightly as she turned pages. Still, she pressed on, reminding herself why this fight mattered so much. Not just for her and Lily, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless against injustice. Meanwhile, the defense team scrambled behind the scenes. Carl, the property manager, grew increasingly agitated, pacing back and forth in his office while fielding frantic calls from Mr. Grayson. "We need to fix this," Grayson barked during one such call. "I don't care how much it costs. Get me the best people on this." But no amount of money could erase the glaring inconsistencies in their case. Documents had been tampered with, notices hadn't been sent, and Maria's meticulous documentation left little room for plausible deniability. For the first time, Carl began to panic, realizing that cutting corners might cost them everything. When the day of the final hearing arrived, Maria woke up early. Her nerves stretched taut like a bowstring. She dressed carefully, choosing the same navy blue dress she'd worn during the first trial. It had become something of a symbol for her, a reminder of where she started and how far she'd come. As she stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her hair and smoothing out imaginary wrinkles, Lily walked into the room. "Mom," Lily said softly, her voice tinged with awe. "You look amazing." Maria smiled, though her heart was racing. "Thanks, sweetheart. Ready to go?" Lily nodded, slipping her hand into Maria's. Together, they made their way to the courthouse, the familiar steps leading up to the grand stone building feeling heavier than before. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Reporters packed the gallery, cameras ready to capture every moment. Neighbors sat shoulder to shoulder, eager to see how the story would unfold. Even some local activists had shown up, holding signs supporting tenant rights and chanting quietly outside. Maria took her seat at the plaintiff's table, clutching her folder tightly. Across the aisle, the defense team looked uneasy. Mr. Peterson flipped through his notes furiously, muttering to himself while Carl avoided eye contact altogether. When the judge entered and called the court to order, the room fell silent. Closing arguments began with the defense. Mr. Peterson rose stiffly, his usual charm replaced by a strained formality. "Your Honor," he began, his voice louder than necessary. "While the plaintiff has raised interesting points, we must consider the broader context. Mistakes happen. Documents can be misinterpreted. My client is a respected member of this community and his intentions have always been honorable." Maria listened intently, noting the desperation in his tone. He was grasping at straws, throwing out vague phrases like broader context and honorable intentions, without offering concrete evidence to refute her claims. When he finally finished, the judge raised an eyebrow but said nothing, turning instead to Maria. It was her turn. Maria stood slowly, taking a deep breath to steady herself. She glanced at the crowd, meeting the eyes of a few familiar faces before focusing on the judge. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and firm. "This case is about more than just my apartment. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that powerful individuals cannot exploit those who lack resources or influence." She paused, letting her words resonate. Then, stepping closer to the bench, she continued. "The defense claims mistakes were made, but let's be honest. These weren't accidents. They altered a legally binding document. They failed to provide proper notice, and when I tried to resolve the issue peacefully, they dismissed me as insignificant. Why? Because they thought I wouldn't fight back." Her voice softened slightly, as she added, "But here I am, standing before you today not because I'm extraordinary, but because I believe in fairness. I believe in justice. And I believe that the law exists to protect everyone, not just those with money and power." The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. Maria pressed on, laying out her argument with precision. She referenced specific sections of tenant rights laws, cited precedents from similar cases, and reminded the judge of the overwhelming evidence she had presented. Each point was delivered with calm authority, leaving no doubt that she had done her homework. Finally, she concluded with a simple yet powerful statement. Your Honor, I ask you to rule in favor of what is right, not just for me, but for every tenant who deserves to feel safe and secure in their home. Let this decision send a message that no one is above the law. As she returned to her seat, the gallery erupted in murmurs. Some people clapped softly while others exchanged astonished glances. Even the bailiff seemed moved, nodding slightly as he jotted down notes. Across the aisle, the defense team exchanged panicked looks. Mr. Peterson attempted a weak rebuttal, but it was clear he was running out of options. After what felt like an eternity, the judge leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. Ms. Thompson, he said, addressing her directly, you've demonstrated remarkable resilience and dedication throughout this trial. Your arguments are compelling, and the evidence you've provided is damning. Based on the facts presented, I find in favor of the plaintiff. The room exploded into cheers. Reporters scrambled to capture Maria's reaction as tears streamed down her face. Lily hugged her tightly, whispering, You did it, Mom. You really did it. Outside the courthouse, the crowd gathered around Maria, congratulating her and thanking her for standing up to injustice. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust toward her, and strangers embraced her as if she were a long-lost friend. For the first time in weeks, Maria allowed herself to truly feel the weight of what she had accomplished. She wasn't just reclaiming her home, she was reclaiming her dignity. But as the excitement settled and the reporters dispersed, Maria realized something profound. This victory wasn't hers alone. It belonged to everyone who had ever felt powerless, everyone who had been told they couldn't win. And as she held Lily close, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she knew this was only the beginning. The days following the trial verdict were a blur for Maria. Her life, once defined by quiet routine and struggles behind closed doors, had suddenly become public property. The story of her courtroom triumph spread like wildfire, not just through her small town but across the region. Local newspapers ran headlines like, Underdog wins big, single mom takes down wealthy landlord, and Justice served, how one woman changed the game. Television stations invited her to share her story on morning talk shows, and social media lit up with posts celebrating her courage. At first, Maria felt overwhelmed by the attention. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight, and the constant stream of messages, calls, and interview requests left her drained. But as she read comments from strangers, people who said her victory gave them hope or inspired them to stand up for their own rights, she began to see the bigger picture. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about sending a message that anyone, regardless of their background or resources, could fight for justice if they refused to give up. Maria's newfound fame brought unexpected opportunities. Tenant advocacy groups reached out, asking her to speak at rallies and workshops. At first, she hesitated, unsure if she was qualified to take on such a role. I'm just a regular person, she told one organizer over the phone. I don't know if I can inspire others. But the organizer laughed warmly. That's exactly why you're perfect for this, Maria. People need to hear from someone like you, someone who faced impossible odds and still found a way to win. You're living proof that ordinary people can make extraordinary things happen. Encouraged by these words, Maria agreed to participate. Her first speaking engagement was at a community center packed with tenants, activists, and even a few curious landlords. As she stepped onto the stage, clutching her notes nervously, the audience erupted into applause. For a moment she froze, taken aback by the warmth and support radiating toward her. Then, smiling shyly, she began to speak. Never thought I'd be standing here today, she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. When I walked into that courtroom, I didn't think I stood a chance. I was scared, tired, and honestly, I doubted myself more times than I can count. But something inside me refused to back down. Maybe it was love for my daughter. Maybe it was anger at being treated unfairly. But whatever it was, it kept me going. She went on to share her journey, from the day she found her belongings dumped in the hallway to the countless late nights spent researching tenant rights laws. She spoke candidly about the challenges she faced, the mockery, the intimidation, the moments when she wanted to give up, and how she overcame them. By the time she finished, the room was silent except for the sound of sniffles and applause. People lined up afterward to thank her, many sharing their own stories of hardship and resilience. As weeks turned into months, Maria became a symbol of hope in her community. Neighbors who had once dismissed her now sought her advice on dealing with difficult landlords. Local charities partnered with her to create workshops aimed at educating renters about their rights. Even Lily noticed the change, proudly telling her friends at school, "My mom's kind of a hero now." Despite the accolades, Maria remained grounded. She returned to her jobs at the diner and office cleaning service, grateful for the stability they provided. Her landlord, Mr. Grayson, was ordered to pay damages for wrongful eviction, which helped Maria secure a new apartment, a modest but cozy place where she and Lily could start fresh. Though the financial compensation was welcome, it was the sense of vindication that meant the most to her. One evening, as Maria sat on the couch with Lily, flipping through photo albums, she paused at a picture of herself from years ago. In it, she looked younger, carefree, and full of dreams she hadn't yet abandoned. "Do you remember what you wanted to be when you grew up?" Lily asked curiously. Maria chuckled softly. "Oh, I wanted to be so many things, a teacher, a writer, maybe even a lawyer. Life had other plans, though." Lily tilted her head thoughtfully. "But isn't that what you did? You were like a lawyer in court. You fought for us, and you won." Maria smiled, pulling her daughter close. "I guess you're right. Maybe I didn't become everything I dreamed of, but I found a way to make a difference. And that's something worth being proud of." In the end, Maria's story transcended her personal victory. It sparked conversations about tenant rights, systemic inequalities, and the importance of standing up against injustice. Lawmakers took notice, introducing bills to strengthen protections for renters and hold landlords accountable for unethical practices. Activists credited Maria with igniting a movement, though she insisted she was simply doing what anyone in her position would have done. Her journey taught her valuable lessons, not just about the law but about herself. She learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was acting despite it. She discovered that preparation and persistence could level the playing field, even against seemingly insurmountable odds. Most importantly, she realized that her voice mattered, and that using it could create ripples of change far beyond what she ever imagined. On quiet evenings, as she watched the sunset from her new apartment window, Maria reflected on how far she'd come. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into that courtroom months ago, unsure of herself and afraid of failure. She was stronger, braver, and more determined than ever to keep fighting, not just for herself, but for everyone who deserved a fair shot at life. And as she tucked Lily into bed each night reading stories of heroes and adventurers, Maria couldn't help but smile, because somewhere along the way she had become one too.